Good everyone. I hope you're having an amazing day. So today I'll be talking about how to write a better trigger. So when I first started out as a Salesforce developer, a few years ago, I was guilty of writing a bad trigger. Anyway, what I meant by bad trigger is just about the way you go and write a jargon code or a spaghetti code uh, at one place. I've done that. So for instance, this is my trigger class. This is a contact trigger. So all I'm doing here is that I'm doing a before insert trigger. So and whenever a before insert trigger get fired, I'm looking at the contact record to see if the title is blank. If the title is blank, so I'm populating it with something called an architect, right? So that will do the job. And let me demonstrate it. And this is the main purpose of today's session is to tell you guys about the way you can write better trigger and using handler and a framework, right? So I'm not going to talk about different triggers framework out there. That will be a point of a separate discussion, which I will be talking about it eventually, later stage when we finish with this refactoring series. But that being said, I will talk about one specific trigger framework. It's not a framework just for trigger, but you can use it for other Apex customization as well. So I'm going to talk about that in a bit, and I'll tell you why it's very efficient and why it's so easy to. It's not really easy to start on it because it has a big learning curve. In spite of that, why I still believe that every enterprise org should use this framework. I'll get into that in a minute. All right, so this is a contact object, right? So let me create a very simple contact here, just with Dave. So I can say Dave Muller, right? So as you can see, when I create this contact, it will initiate a trigger behind the scene. That's the before insert trigger. Now, what this trigger will do, it will look for this architect title. Sorry, not architect. Sorry, look for this title, and if the title is blank, it will populate this with an architect text. Right? It's pretty straightforward. So I'll save. Okay, now it's cool, right? It's pretty simple. A trigger is doing what it's supposed to do. Now you might wonder, right? What's the problem with this trigger, right? It's doing the job. It looks great. So what's the problem? Why are we talking about trigger refactoring today, right? What's the issue with the trigger? There are a lot of issues here. First of all, this is a before insert trigger. Okay. Now, what if you want, say, after insert, before delete? So most likely you will come here and say, let's say, after insert, yeah, and then you will say, oh, okay, so you're gonna use the flag if the trigger dot, whatever, if is insert and if the trigger dot, um, uh, before insert, so then you do this and you do that, right? So what are you going to end up doing? Will be doing. You will make this code a messy code, right? You will write your business logic here, okay, which is a very bad practice. The number one, okay, you should never write your business logic within a trigger, okay. So the reason why you should not be writing it, it's very difficult to test it, okay. So what if you wanted to reuse this, say, logic in another trigger, let's say in an opportunity trigger, okay? So most likely you're going to end up in copy paste certain part of the code, which is very bad, right? Because like I always say, code duplication is very bad when it comes to programming because it causes technical debt. Okay, so this part of the code is really bad, right? And now what happens, let's say you're doing a data loading, right, and you wanted to deactivate the trigger. So obviously uh, you have to go and deactivate it in the code, or right, or so, which is in the production, which is not really good because then you have to seek the help of a developer. Let's say you're not an Apex developer, you are a Salesforce admin or a Salesforce functional consultant who have no idea about the Apex code. Take it for the sake of an argument, right? I'm not saying that functional consultants are not capable of doing programming. I have worked with few, they can code, but just for the sake of argument, just assume that you're a functional consultant who's not comfortable with Apex code, right? And you've been given a task to data load, let's say, contacts, and you wanted to deactivate this trigger, right? So now you don't have a developer in the team, so you will struggle, right? Because you have to, and this is a production code, for instance, okay? So obviously, some of the companies I know what they've used, right? They used a flag in a custom settings to say, you know, very common approach, what I've seen, right? They use the flag in the custom settings to say enable, say, contact trigger. So if you put that tick box on, right, it will enable, say, let's say, if, for instance, right, if customs setting, whatever, right, dot, say, enable trigger, right? So disable trigger. If a disable trigger, then you just return it, right? So you do nothing. So this flag can control it, like I've seen in some of the companies that use this way, which is a pretty common trigger bypass pattern, which is okay, but it has its own problems. I'll tell you the problems in a minute. So this is one approach, like I said, many companies uses it. But that being said, it's still not good to write all your business logic within a trigger. This is a bad practice, okay? So the common approach what people use is that they create a separate handler, okay? So something like that, right? Which I talked about in the past. There's nothing wrong with that. So something like that, say contact um, handler dot, say update, whatever, right? So one line of a code, which is pretty straightforward, easy to write, and easy to test, right? And easy to read as well. Now, but there's still a problem with this one, right? The problem I tell you is that now, most of the time, um, say I wanted to when I talk about the bypass trigger framework, right? I don't. There must be a scenario where you don't want it to bypass, say after insert or before insert or whatever, right? Or let's say you only wanted to bypass before insert. You don't want it to bypass after insert. So to develop that using a common approach, right? Using this approach, it's get very challenging, right? Then you have to write lots of code, and it gets messy, right? And it gets messy. And another problem with this approach of writing a very simple handler, if you are working in a big org, right? Let's say you're working for a big organization, right? And different vendors are working for the same product, right? So let's say a vendor X has 6 developers working on an org, and let's say a vendor Y has 3 developers, right? And they all have to share the same org. So the problem of using a this kind of approach is, right? One vendor will say, "Oh, look, I wanted to use a different approach of writing a trigger." Okay, and another vendor will say, "Look, I wanted to use a different approach." So you can see that a lot of inconsistency can come into the org, right? Which is not really a good way for any company in the long run. It costs technical debt, right? So what happens is that when you look at the code, it looks like 50 people have touched the code, same part of a code, which is not a good practice whatsoever. So keeping that into consideration, I would like to prescribe I would like you to suggest that you guys look at a framework called Financial Force FFlib framework, right? It is an enterprise pattern framework. So I'll show you how my code can get changed when I use a framework. So let me comment this code. Okay, I've installed FFlib, and I'll show you the GitHub page where you can install the Financial Force lib. So there are 2 parts of in that framework has 2 components. One is the mock, and one is the lib, right? FFlib common. Okay, so before you install FFlib common, you have to install the mock. Mocks are usually for unit tests, right? As you all know that when you write a trigger, right, or any Apex customization, you have to write a unit test. So The financial force gives you that mock and stub to write the unit test in a very efficient way. Okay. Now I'll show you how the triggers get very simplified using a financial force. So just for a second, just to this. So this is the Apex. It's an open source, right? And it's written by a guy from Financial Force, Andy. I mean, I worked on Financial Force product. I worked on PSA, professional service automation. So that's one of the products of theirs I've worked on, and I've done customization on that as well. So that being said, this is a place if you wanted to check it out, I would highly encourage you to do so. And there is something called FFlib Apex Common Sample Code. I would highly encourage you to install this one and go through it. And I will do a separate series on Financial Force because this is an amazing enterprise pattern. Because I worked on enterprise architecture, and because not on specifically on the Salesforce side, but on the .NET side. I used to work on a ERP product, and it's exactly the way the developer was, everything to do with enterprise architecture, right? You have a selector class, you have a domain controller, you have a service layer, and you have an application layer, you have a unit of work, and it's pretty amazing. And especially when I looked at the FFlib comment for the first time, I like this looks very familiar to me because I've been doing similar stuff on the C# side, right? So, like I always used to say, I'm not a Salesforce developer. I mean, I haven't started my software development as a Salesforce developer. I started as a C++ developer. Then I worked on Delphi. Then I worked on .NET. .NET is still my favorite language, along with Delphi, right? Because if you really worked on .NET technology, you'll know that you can write a robust enterprise level code, right? And that's where the frameworks are very important. And Andy from Financial Force done a pretty good job, doing this effort, and their development team, of course, doing that FFlib Apex comment. When I looked at this code for the first time, I was pretty impressed, right? And gives you a lot of flexibility as well. Okay, so enough of ranting. So this is a place. I'll put the link in the description below if you are interested. Please check it out. And I'll show you one advantage what it offers, and you won't find that part of a configuration in Financial Force. This is because I built that on top of FFlib, but I'll show you in a minute. Um, so I'm gonna so I changed that code, right? And my code is now. So this is my trigger code now. So let me deploy the source. So as you can see that I have a handler class. This is a contact FF handler. And this is all I have to do, one line of code. And one thing I just have to tell you guys, please do not write more than one trigger on a single object. That's a very bad practice, okay? And another thing I'll have to tell you as well, please do not use SQL query inside a trigger. You always have to bulkify your code. That's a very common thing, right? I presume you guys all know, but just wanted to, mention that anyways. Okay, so I got this trigger, right? So as you can see, I put before insert, before update, everything, right? So it doesn't matter what I put it here, okay? You should put every operation here, and let your handler decide how to write the code, how to figure out, right? So this is a handler, and this is a domain class, right? You can see that basic class aiding in the implementation of a domain model. So if you do not understand what domain means or service means, I would highly encourage you to please read out Martin Fowler Enterprise Design Pattern book. It's an amazing book, right? And it will give you a better understanding about why enterprise architecture is very important, especially when you're dealing with enterprise level org, right? So this is a trigger handler, and this is a handler I created, contact FF handler. So you create any trigger you want, right? Any trigger. So this will remains the same, okay? All you have to do is that write your own handler. So in my case, I've written contact FF handler, and dot class is a type, okay? So I go to the handler here in a second. So this is a handler, right? So when you look at the handler, right? So you can see that I've extended this FFlib domain, so which is this one, right? And so it extends the FFlib object. So if you want to know more, please install this in your org and go through it, right? So I just wanted to showcase you the advantage of using it. It's pretty interesting, right? And now don't worry about the logger. This is another thing which I will talk about it eventually. Like if you wanted to do a logging, so you can do that. And so this is like a constructor for this. And this is very important because you are hooking up. This is like you're doing a dependency injection here. Okay, so you are implementing a constructor here, which is implements the iConstructible, and then you're returning a handler. So now the real stuff happens here, right? On before insert. Like I said, I'm not interested in after insert or after delete. I'm only interested in on before insert. So all I have to do is write a method. If I'm after, let's say, after insert, right? So you can do public override void, right? You can say on after, on after insert, and you can override it, and you can write your logic here, like so. So as you can see that it gives you that flexibility of writing a trigger using a different methods. Like you can actually control the execution of this method as well. And let's say, for instance, if you wanted to write um, a trigger bypass framework, you don't have to use the good old custom settings. You can pretty much hook up your logic inside the domain layer, right? I've done that. I'll show you, but due to NDA reason, I can't show you my code, but I can show you in the UI how it looks like. So I'll explain to you. So now look, the thing is that I do understand that you might ask me, oh, okay, why do I bother with this one, right? Why can't I use a simple handler? So that goes to the same thing which I've explained to you before. If you are dealing with a simple org, right, where only one or two developers, then I presume that this may not be a great choice. You can probably look at other trigger framework out there, pretty simple one, and there is a non-profit trigger framework out there as well. Have a look at that one to see if it fits your requirement, or you can might as well do a separate handler class if you have only two developers doing the stuff, right? And it's very simple org. But if you are dealing with a enterprise level org where 20 to 30 developers working, then I would highly encourage you to go this route because it gives you so much of flexibility. It will force you to follow a single standard instead of every other developer reinventing the wheel. So having a FFlib in picture will enforce you to follow a strict standards, right? And then it will also help you to write a better organized code. So that being said, you do need to know how to write a selector. Um, so um, so this is about a something like a selector class, where so now you might wonder what is selector, right? So selector class is a class in simple terms which deals with the queries, right? So you don't obviously, let's say, let me give you an example. Like you have a contact query, right? So you have a contact query. You obviously do select, ID, first name, last name from contact, and do whatever you wanted to do, right? So and then let's say you wanted to reuse the same contact query. Most probably, what are you going to do? You will put it into a utility class, okay, which is okay. But now think about the case when you wanted to um, have more options around that contact selection, right? Then you probably end up in creating more functions, more stuff, and you have to add. And let's say a developer, say from an X vendor, somehow uh, without realizing that there is an existing utility class, he or she, decide to write their own utility class. Now you see a problem, right? You have a utility class written by a previous vendor. Now another vendor developers decide to write a utility class because they, for whatever reason, they did decide to check, right? If there's an existing utility class. Now, having a selector class will solve the problem because there will be only one single point of truth, right? That's it. If it's a contact, there will be only a single contact selector. End of story. There's no utility class to do with the selection. Everything will go to a contact selector. Like for instance, this is an opportunity selector, right? So everything to do with the opportunity, so it extends the selector and everything, and then it implements this interface. So everything to do with the opportunity selection, right? Uh, like a query will be handled in this specific class, right? So that's how precise, and that's how uh, enterprise architecture works, right? You can't use a query in a query SQL queries in the domain layer. That's not how it works. If you wanted to use a database operation, you have to use a selector class, you know, and you have to call the selector class from service layer or domain layer, wherever you wanted to call, right? You can never write a bare bones SOCL inside a domain layer. That's not how the enterprise works, because it will break the entire architecture and it defeats the whole purpose, right? So having this architecture will enforce that you will have a better coding standard in place, and it will enforce that you will test your code efficiently, a better you know structured object-oriented programming and better architecture. That's why I always believe in one thing, right? I mean, I've seen this a strange trend in Salesforce because, like I said, I'm pretty old school, right? I came from a programming background, so I've seen that people say that they are an architect, right? Especially in Salesforce side, and they are not comfortable with programming, which really surprises me, right? Because in because in my technology, right, where I worked in the .NET, I worked in Delphi, I worked in C++. Often, a technical architect have a strong programming background, right? Because let me give you an example. I'm not talking about a functional architect; they are different. I understand that functional architect and solution architect are different as well, because at times solution architects do not code, but most of the solution architects I worked with, they have experience with programming, but they come from a business perspective, so that's different. Okay, so I'm talking more specifically about technical architect, right? So the problem with the technical architect in Salesforce, right, when they claim they're a technical architect and they can't understand this kind of stuff, it really makes me a bit uncomfortable, right? Because then I'm not very comfortable taking a suggestion from an architect, right? So for instance, right, if I'm starting off a developer, right, and if I've been exposed to, say, an enterprise design pattern, and if there's a technical architect in the team, and I go to him saying, look, I'm having an issue understanding how the domain layer interface with the service layer. Could you explain to me? If that person is not comfortable explaining to me that, then I will not be comfortable going to that same person again for an advice, because I'll think, he's not really good enough. I will probably reach out to a senior developer who knows the stuff, right? So that's why I must say that, I mean, like I said, if you're a functional architect, that's okay. I mean, I understand it comes from a very different perspective. That I respect that. It's pretty great because functional architects have a lot of functional knowledge. There are a lot of, you know, they come from a business perspective, overall, perspective from a business point of view, which is great. And solution architects, they do, a combination of both, which is great. Technical architect, I do believe that should know functional, but should be extremely stronger on the technical side. Especially, they should have a strong grasp of programming language. Especially if they're Salesforce, they should know LWC. They should have a good understanding of Apex. They should have understanding about enterprise design architecture if they're an architect, right? Sorry, I didn't want to rant, but so this is one of the advantages, like I said, and I've used this financial force, so I will highly encourage you to use it. Now, one of the things which I said I'll show you. This is something I have built on top of it. This is, you won't get out of box, right? I talked about the bypass trigger framework, right? Let's say I wanted to. I'm an admin, okay? Let's say I'm a Salesforce admin, and I'm doing a data loading, and I wanted to disable before insert trigger operation, just the before insert trigger operation. I don't care about after delete or after insert. I'm interested to shut down a before insert operation. Okay, can you do that using Financial Force? You can absolutely do that. I built this configuration on top of it. I'll just show you. It's pretty cool. So I built something called FFlib config. So what I've done, right? This is a custom object I built. and I hooked up to the FFlib domain layer. So that's pretty much it. So I wanted to I wanted to disable before insert. So for the contact, so I mentioned under class name the contact FF handler, which is the name of this class, right? Okay, and then I've specified the operation. So right now I haven't specified anything. Okay, so if I run it, okay, so let me show you. Now remember, I've changed my trigger. Okay, now let me just a second. I just wanted to see if I deploy the source because I'm using financial force handler, right? Now I'm not using a regular handler. So let me create a new, and the behavior should be similar. So Dave, okay. So since I'm not specifying a title, so it should put architect there. Okay, architect there, fantastic, right? Now let me go and delete this one. Now say I'm a sysadmin, right? And I do not want this trigger to get fired because I'm doing a data load operation. So I don't have to go and change the code in a production, right? I don't have to go for and look for a developer. All I have to do come here and I can see, oh, okay. So I have a contact trigger handler here. Okay, so let me see what all the trigger types. Okay, I'm interested in before and set. Okay. Like I said, you won't get this out of box from FFlib. I built this, so I can't share the code unfortunately because of NDA. I built this for a client, so it's a code I can't share. But since this is an open source, I just wanted to show you the things which you can do. It's very flexible. You can do amazing stuff, right? If someone comes in and tell you, oh, Financial Force lib is not configurable, you can show them my video. Look, this is configurable. This is sitting on top of Financial Force library. Okay. So now I decided to disable the before insert. Let's create a contact, right? Now go here and just going to say Dave, right? I'm just going to do, yeah, Muller. Okay. And title. Okay. See, title is not populated because the trigger is disabled. Okay. Now, if I wanted to enable again, so all you have to do is just go back here and do this, right? Yeah, and I made it other stuff as well behind the scene, but just to give you context, right? This is like a part of a bypass trigger framework. You can do that. I mean, I don't have to use a custom object to hook up to every code. I just have to use it at one place. So see the advantage. See, it just only have to worry about one configuration here, right? So if you wanted to say disable other trigger handler, so just have to create a new. And I've also ensure that you can't select the same trigger handler. You can't add the same trigger handler again and again as a record because that will obviously break it. So yeah, so that's one of the things you can do. So it's like I said, it's pretty configurable. You know, so this is a part of a code refactoring. Although you may say that this has gone bit, way beyond code refactoring, but I'm really passionate about enterprise architecture because, you know, uh, when I look at the code, right, I don't look code from a point of writing it. I just look from a point of entire design, right? Because if you're an architect, you have to wear the hat of a developer, a business analyst. You have to wear the hat of a functional consultant, a tester, sometimes even a hacker, right? Because a developer can fiddle with it. Admin say, okay, let me break it. They try to break it. So you have to think from different perspective. Okay. So this is pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed today's session. So if you have any questions around Financial Force Library, please do reach out to me. Please put a comment. I will try to respond. Or you can follow me on LinkedIn as well. It's your choice. No pressure. I don't use Instagram kind of stuff. Not my cup of tea, right? I'm pretty old school, like I said. That being said, I did mention that I'm gonna do a podcast, invite a speaker. So I am working on that, and I got three people there willing to talk. Pretty great people, extremely talented, very you will see when I bring them to my show. So this is not a video show. This is just a like a good old fashioned radio talking. So we will talk about the speaker's experience, why they choose Salesforce, what they like about it, and I have to respect the time as well because I will make sure that it's 30 minutes or less than that. I can't go for more than that because they're all very busy people. So and I'm grateful that they agreed to talk on my show, which is amazing. So so yeah. So that being said, I hope you guys have a great weekend. Take care. Adios.